Totally wrong. Medieval facts, everyone still believes, and more. The word medieval often drips with shadows in the way it is spoken today. To many, the Middle Ages is remembered as 1,000 years of darkness, superstition, filth, and ignorance. We imagine peasants never smiling, cities drowning in mud, kings swinging swords without thought, and churches suppressing every spark of knowledge. But much of what we think we know about the medieval world is not truth at all. They are myths, repeated so often they harden into what feels like memory. To step closer, however, is to discover a different world. Not a world free of hardship, but a world of complexity, resilience, creativity, and survival. The Middle Ages were not the frozen wasteland of thought that many still believe. They were a bridge carrying fragile humanity between the collapse of Rome and the birth of the modern world. And in that bridge are lessons that still speak to us today. One of the most enduring myths is that medieval people thought the earth was flat. How many times have we heard that the sailors of Columbus trembled at the edge of the ocean, fearing to fall off the edge of the world? Yet the truth is that since antiquity, educated Europeans knew the earth was a sphere. Medieval scholars read Aristotle, Ptolemy, Augustine, and countless other voices that affirmed a round world. The sight of ships vanishing over the horizon, hull before mast, was proof visible to any sailor. The myth of the flat Earth Middle Ages was invented centuries later, used to paint the era as foolish and blind. But this was never their truth. And here lies the first lesson. How often do we accept as reality the stories told by those who never lived them? How often do we reduce complexity to caricature, repeating judgments instead of listening to voices of the past? Another falsehood is that medieval people never bathed. We imagine men and women coated in filth, never knowing the feel of clean skin. Yet bathhouses existed in towns across Europe, and public baths, though sometimes frowned upon for moral reasons, were widespread. Soap, often made from animal fats and lye, was in use, and medieval medical texts recommended hygiene as essential to health. Even peasants bathed in rivers and streams when they could. Did they have showers like ours? Of course not, but to imagine they wallowed in dirt for centuries is to mistake poverty for indifference and scarcity for ignorance. They valued cleanliness, even if it looked different than ours. And here is another lesson. When we simplify the past into mockery, we rob those who lived it of their dignity. It is easier to laugh at them than to learn from them. But laughter, at the expense of truth, leaves us poorer. There is also the tale that medieval people never smiled, that theirs was an age of grim faces, permanent suffering. Yet art from cathedrals to manuscripts shows faces full of joy, playfulness, even mischief. Festivals, feasts, carnivals, these were woven into the rhythm of the year. Laughter, though it rang through different jokes and different fears, still rang. They lived, and living always brings joy alongside grief. To say otherwise is to forget that even in hardship, people dream, people laugh, people love. Do we not do the same today, laughing in the face of our own crises? So why should we imagine that they did not? The Middle Ages is also accused of being an age without knowledge, as if all learning had disappeared after Rome's fall. But the great monasteries preserved ancient texts, copying them by hand in scriptoria, where silence was prayer and writing was devotion. Universities arose in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, teaching law, theology, philosophy, and natural science. To be sure, not all knowledge was equally pursued, and some ideas were bound by the limits of faith and fear. But the narrative of pure ignorance ignores the sparks of genius that burned in those centuries, from Aquinas' philosophy to Chaucer's poetry, from the arches of Gothic cathedrals to the mathematics of Islamic Spain flowing into Europe. Their minds were not asleep. They were awake, searching, wrestling with truth as all humans do. And what of medicine? We are told they believed only in leeches and prayers, as if no healing knowledge existed. Yes, they lacked the science we have now, and yes, superstition often mixed with practice, but herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and public health measures were very real. During plagues, cities attempted quarantines, physicians debated causes, sometimes wrongly, but sometimes with insight. The path was crooked, but the effort was genuine. They did what they could with what they had, and isn't that what we do as well? Fight with the tools available, uncertain if they are enough? Their courage lay not in perfection, but in persistence. The myth of medieval brutality also requires nuance. We think of constant torture, of witches burned by the thousands, of streets soaked in blood. But the scale was different than the myths suggest. Witch hunts, for instance, peaked in the early modern era, not the medieval. Violence existed, yes, wars, punishments, cruelty. But theirs was not an age uniquely savage compared to others. To say otherwise is to use them as a canvas on which to paint our own superiority. We call them brutal, so that we may call ourselves enlightened. Yet what of our wars, our prisons, our injustices? Perhaps mocking the past is easier than facing the mirror. Even chivalry, so often romanticized, is misunderstood. We imagine knights living by a pure code of honor, defending ladies and fighting for justice. The reality was harsher. Knights were often ruthless, their codes more aspirational than actual. But the existence of the code at all, the attempt to bind violence with ideals, speaks of a longing for meaning. They wanted to believe that even in war there could be justice, even in conflict, honor. Perhaps they failed, but the attempt itself shows the human desire to make sense of chaos. And that desire, though dressed in armor, is the same as ours, to live in a world that feels fairer than it is. All these myths, repeated as truths, remind us of how fragile memory can be. The Middle Ages was not a golden age, nor was it only darkness. It was, like every age, a mixture of ignorance and wisdom, of cruelty and compassion, of despair and hope. And perhaps that is why its story matters so much. For to strip it down to caricature is to deny the fullness of humanity that lived then. They too struggled, they too endured, they too hoped. When you close your eyes tonight and think of the medieval world, do not imagine only mud, plague, and fear. Imagine also the candlelight of monks copying books by hand, ensuring that voices of the past survive to reach us. Imagine laughter at village festivals, music played on lutes and flutes echoing across stone walls. Imagine the quiet courage of parents raising children in uncertainty, the resilience of peasants who bent their backs to the land and still found time to sing. Imagine that they were not so unlike us. And here is the greater truth. The myths we believe about them say less about their time and more about ours. We want to believe they were ignorant, so we can believe we are wise. We want to believe they were dirty, so we can believe we are clean. We want to believe they were cruel, so we can believe we are just. But history whispers otherwise. It whispers, do not be so sure of your superiority. You too are flawed, and yet you too are enduring. The Middle Ages was not perfect, but it was alive. And in its survival, in its persistence, in its beauty, hidden among hardship, it offers us a mirror. If they could endure their winters of fear, perhaps we can endure ours. If they could laugh in their ruins, perhaps we can laugh in ours. If they could keep memory alive through centuries of uncertainty, perhaps we too can carry forward what matters most. And so, tonight, when you hear the word medieval, do not picture only shadows. Picture candles, laughter, courage. Picture people as real as we are, walking through their worst years with dignity and with hope. For the Middle Ages was not a dead age, it was a bridge, and bridges, however fragile, carry us forward. To continue walking through the myths of the medieval world is to step deeper into a mirror where we often see more of ourselves than of them. For every misconception about the Middle Ages is not simply an error of fact, it is also a story we tell to shape our own identity. By calling them dark, we call ourselves enlightened. By calling them ignorant, we crown ourselves as wise. Yet the reality, as always, is more complex. Tonight, let us sit with these stories and uncover truths hidden beneath the dust of exaggeration. One of the most common myths is that medieval people believed life was only suffering. Certainly their world was hard. Wars scarred fields, plagues swept towns, hunger lingered in many homes. Yet to imagine that their days were nothing but misery is to erase the fullness of their humanity. For they celebrated feasts with music and dancing. They honored seasonal rhythms with festivals. They married, they told jokes, they sang while working. Laughter, though quieter than suffering, always echoed. Even in famine, a wedding might fill a village with joy. Even in war, a lull in battle might find soldiers singing. To call their world only suffering is to forget that joy and sorrow always coexist, then as now. And perhaps this teaches us to be careful with our own lives, to remember that even when shadow dominates, light is never fully gone. Another myth paints the medieval period as one in which science did not exist. People imagined that reason was smothered, that curiosity was forbidden. But the truth is more nuanced. Monks observed stars from monastery towers, charting heavens as acts of devotion. Scholars in universities debated Aristotle and Galen, asking questions of nature and of medicine. The great Islamic scholars of the period, Avicenna, Averroes, Alhazen, were studied in Europe, shaping thought and paving the way for later science. Did they have telescopes and laboratories as we do? No. But they asked questions, they tested ideas, they observed patterns. Science is not defined by its tools, but by its curiosity. And they were curious, endlessly so. The myth of medieval anti-science blinds us to the truth that every step of progress is built upon imperfect beginnings. And what of women in the Middle Ages? We are told they had no voice, no power, no presence outside the home. Certainly, patriarchy shaped their world as it has shaped most of history. But women were queens, regents, abbesses, merchants, healers. Eleanor of Aquitaine commanded political landscapes. Hildegard of Bingen wrote music, science, and theology still studied today. In towns, women ran shops, brewed ale, managed estates. On farms, their labor was essential, their presence constant. To erase them into silence is not only false, it is unjust. The myth of female absence serves to flatten history into one voice, when in truth it was always a chorus. Their courage may not always have been celebrated then, but we can honor it now. The idea that the medieval church only suppressed knowledge is also an exaggeration. It did control much, yes, and it often silenced dissent. But it also preserved, transmitted, and even encouraged learning. Monasteries became vaults of memory, copying texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. Cathedrals themselves were books of stone and glass, teaching theology through light and architecture. Universities, birthed in religious soil, became cradles of thought that carried reason forward. To say the church only suppressed is to ignore the complexity of its role, both jailer and guardian, both oppressor and preserver. And here lies another lesson. Institutions are never simple. They may limit, but they may also sustain. And in that tension, history always moves. Another caricature is that medieval justice was only cruelty, dungeons, torture, burnings. While punishments could indeed be brutal, they were not the only form of justice. Mediation, fines, and oaths were common. Communities sought not only to punish, but to restore peace, to repair broken order. Even trial by ordeal, strange as it seems, reflected a belief that truth must somehow be revealed when human words failed. Was it flawed? Yes, but it was also a search for fairness in a world of limited tools. To call it only barbaric is to deny the sincere human desire to live in order rather than chaos, and that desire unites us across centuries. Consider also the myth that medieval people were cut off from the wider world, living in isolated bubbles of ignorance. In truth, medieval Europe was a crossroads. Trade flowed along rivers and roads. The Silk Road connected Europe to Asia, bringing spices, silk, and ideas. Pilgrimages carried people across continents. Crusades, though violent and tragic, also brought cultural exchange, however unwilling. The medieval world was not closed. It was porous, shifting, alive with contact. To believe otherwise is to forget how interconnected human history has always been. And then there is the myth that medieval castles and cities were always grey, dirty, and lifeless. Archaeology tells us differently. Castles were painted in bright colors, towns decorated with banners, markets full of vibrancy. Manuscripts reveal a palette of blues, reds, and golds. The world of the Middle Ages was not only mud, it was also color, texture, and beauty. To imagine otherwise is to look backward through a fog of prejudice, forgetting that people then loved beauty as much as we do now. What do these myths reveal? They reveal how we build distance between ourselves and the past. By calling them foolish, we make ourselves wise. By calling them dirty, we make ourselves clean. By calling them cruel, we make ourselves just. Yet the mirror shows otherwise. Their world was not so different from ours. They endured hardship and celebrated joy. They struggled with ignorance and reached for wisdom. They failed often, but they also dreamed. When you close your eyes tonight and imagine the medieval world, do not see only darkness. See the monk bent over parchment, keeping alive the wisdom of ages. See the woman at market selling her goods, her children laughing at her side. See the carpenter raising beams, the mason carving stone, the musician plucking a lute in a candlelit hall. See them as human, as fragile, as alive as we are. And here is the deeper truth. The myths we carry about the Middle Ages remind us not to be too proud of our own age. For one day, centuries from now, others may tell stories about us. They may call us blind where we think ourselves enlightened. They may laugh at our science, mock our customs, exaggerate our flaws. We too will become myth in someone else's story. And so, the lesson is humility, to know that we are not so far from those we judge. The Middle Ages was not perfect, but neither is today. And if they could find beauty in their shadows, perhaps we can find light in ours. If they could laugh in their ruins, perhaps we can laugh in ours. If they could carry knowledge across centuries, perhaps we can carry wisdom forward too. History whispers they endured, and so can we. The tapestry of the Middle Ages is often shown to us as if it were woven only in black threads. Darkness, ignorance, filth, cruelty. But if we lean closer, if we run our fingers along the threads of history, we see that the fabric was not only black, but filled with colors. Bright, subtle, fragile, enduring. The myths we repeat about medieval life are not just mistakes, they are distortions that steal dignity from those who lived before us. And in stealing their dignity, we risk forgetting the resilience and wisdom hidden in their lives. Tonight, let us sit once more by the quiet fire of memory and untangle these myths, not to glorify the past, but to restore its humanity. One of the most stubborn myths is that medieval peasants lived lives of endless misery, chained to fields without rest, without joy, without worth. Certainly their lives were hard. They bent under the sun, plowed soil with wooden tools, and feared famine every winter. But they also lived in communities bound together by ritual, feast days, songs, and traditions. The church calendar itself was woven with festivals that gave rhythm to toil. Christmas, Easter, harvest feasts, saints' days, all were times when even the poorest found respite in food, laughter, and music. To imagine that they only suffered is to miss the truth that joy has always been humanity's rebellion against hardship. And perhaps this is a lesson for us too, that even in our long seasons of struggle, we can still claim moments of celebration, however small, as defiance against despair. Another common falsehood is that the medieval world was entirely closed. To progress, that 1,000 years passed without invention, yet the Middle Ages gave us eyeglasses, mechanical clocks, windmills, improved ploughs, watermills, and advances in architecture that still astonish us. Gothic cathedrals, rising like stone prayers into the sky, were feats of engineering that married faith with mathematics. Bridges spanned rivers, universities structured thought, and commerce developed banking systems that still echo in our economies. These were not people frozen in ignorance. They were builders, experimenters, innovators. Their world was not stagnant. It was in motion, struggling, experimenting, reshaping itself slowly but surely. The myth of stagnation leaps, but in patient, stubborn steps. We are also told that medieval people never traveled, that they lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. While it is true that most peasants lived close to their land, the medieval world was far from static. Pilgrimages took thousands to Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and Rome. Merchants crossed mountains and seas, linking markets from London to Constantinople. Students traveled to study in Paris or Bologna, bringing home new ideas. Even crusaders, tragic though their wars were, carried cultural exchange across continents. The medieval world was not closed, but open, porous, restless. To deny this is to imagine them as prisoners of soil, when in truth many walked farther than we would expect. And here lies another lesson, that human curiosity has never been limited by poverty or fear. It has always sought new horizons. Another myth whispers that medieval people were obsessed only with death, that they lived in perpetual fear of plague and sin. True, they confronted mortality daily in ways we can hardly imagine. Plagues swept suddenly, famine struck cruelly, wars raged unpredictably. Death was near, always near. But their response was not only fear, it was art, music, faith, ritual. They painted death into murals, yes, but also carved hope into cathedrals. They buried the dead with prayers, but they also danced, feasted, and sang. To live in a world where death is near is not to give up on life, but to live it with sharper urgency. Their obsession with death was not surrender. It was a way of making life more precious, and perhaps this is what they teach us, that remembering death is not to fall into despair, but to cherish each breath we still hold. We often hear that medieval knights were only brutal thugs in armor, violent and unthinking. But knights, though often violent, also wrestled with ideals. Chivalry, however imperfectly practiced, sought to bind the sword with a code. Tournaments, though bloody, became stages for honor as well as violence. And though many knights failed to live their code, the very existence of such a code tells us something important. Even in chaos, humanity longs for meaning. To seek honor in war, however flawed, is still to seek light in shadow, and perhaps this longing is not so distant from us. For do we not also try to bind our power with laws, our violence with justice, our chaos with rules? Knights remind us that ideals are fragile, but they matter, for without them life is only brutality. The myth that medieval art was crude and lifeless also steals beauty from them. We imagine flat figures without perspective, colorless churches, graceless carvings, yet their manuscripts glowed with gold leaf, their stained glass painted light into stories, their sculptures breathed life from stone. Gothic architecture lifted eyes to heaven, not just through height but through color, geometry, and light. Their art was not empty, it was charged with faith, with longing, with imagination. To mock it as primitive is to forget that art is not judged only by realism, but by meaning. And their art meant everything to them. It made the invisible visible, the sacred tangible, the eternal present. In their art, they survived the darkness by making beauty blaze. Then there is the myth that medieval people were entirely cut off from nature, that they lived only in filth and disease. In truth, their lives were interwoven with the cycles of earth. Farmers knew soil, seasons, seeds. Healers knew herbs, roots, waters. Shepherds knew the songs of flocks and fields. Even in towns, markets thrummed with the produce of fields and forests. To live in the Middle Ages was to live close to the land, closer than most of us today. And though they feared famine and disease, they also celebrated harvest, prayed for rain, and thanked the earth for its gifts. They were not estranged from nature. They were immersed in it. Perhaps in this they had wisdom we have lost. Wisdom we now seek to remember as we stand distant from the soil that feeds us. So many myths about the medieval world boil down to this, that they were less human than us. Less clean, less wise, less kind, less alive. But the truth is that they were fully human as we are. They struggled, they hoped, they failed, they endured. Their world was different, but their hearts beat the same rhythm. When we erase their dignity with myths, we also forget the courage that carried them through centuries of hardship. And that courage, once seen, can inspire us still. Close your eyes and imagine them not as shadows, but as people. A peasant smiling as he shares bread with a neighbor. A monk bending over parchment, writing words that would survive centuries. A knight kneeling in prayer before battle, trembling as any human would. A mother singing to her child her voice, carrying hope into the dark night. These are the Middle Ages, not caricatures, but lives real and enduring. And here is the final lesson of these myths. The stories we tell about others reveal who we are. To reduce them to ignorance is to feed our pride. To restore their humanity is to humble our own. When we see them as alive, complex, enduring, we see ourselves more clearly too. For their myths are our mirror, and their truths are our inheritance. The Middle Ages was not only darkness, it was also light. It was not only ignorance, it was also wisdom. It was not only suffering, it was also joy. And if they could endure their winters, so can we endure ours. If they could laugh in their ruins, so can we laugh in ours. If they could carry memory through centuries, so can we carry hope through tomorrow. So let us remember them not with mockery, but with reverence. For they whisper still, "We endured. You can too." The phrase "Dark Ages" has echoed for centuries, whispered in classrooms, repeated in documentaries, spoken with a kind of smug certainty. The Middle Ages was nothing but darkness. 1,000 years when civilization supposedly slumbered in ignorance. But is that really true? Was the medieval world truly a void between the brilliance of Rome and the rebirth of the Renaissance? Or is the idea of darkness itself a myth? One created not by those who lived in those centuries, but by later generations who needed to believe they were more enlightened than those who came before. The truth is far more complex and far more inspiring. The so-called Dark Ages were not void of light. They were filled with sparks, fragile, flickering, but real. Sparks of knowledge preserved in monasteries, sparks of creativity carved into cathedrals, sparks of resilience glowing in towns rebuilt after war, sparks of joy in festivals that lit up long winters. To call it only dark is to erase the humanity of millions who lived, dreamed, struggled, and built in that time. And perhaps the greatest mistake of all is to forget that their endurance is the very reason we are here. The idea of a dark age was born much later during the Renaissance, when scholars eager to celebrate their own brilliance needed a foil, a shadow to make their light shine brighter. They looked back on the centuries before them and called them dark, as if nothing had existed in between Rome's fall and their own rise. But the truth is that knowledge had not vanished. It had shifted, it had scattered, it had transformed. And sometimes light shines brightest when it is carried carefully through shadow. In monasteries, monks bent over parchment by candlelight, copying texts line by line. These were not just prayers or sermons, though those too were copied, but works of philosophy, history, medicine, and science. Without their devotion, the words of Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, Galen, Augustine, and countless others might have vanished forever. Picture the quiet of the scriptorium, the scratching of quills, the smell of ink, the flicker of flame. Every page completed was an act of defiance against oblivion. To call those centuries dark is to ignore the light that survived because of those hands. And beyond preservation, there was creation. Gothic cathedrals were not shadows. They were monuments of stone and glass that soared into the heavens, filled with light. Their builders calculated with geometry, designed with artistry, and dreamed with faith. Towns bustled with trade, markets rang with laughter, guilds organized labor, and universities began to shape minds. These were not people groping in darkness. They were people building bridges to the future. Consider the invention of mechanical clocks in the 13th century, transforming the way humans measured time. Consider eyeglasses, giving new life to tired eyes. Consider windmills and watermills, harnessing nature's power with ingenuity. Consider literature, Dante's Divine Comedy, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, epic poems and mystical visions. Do these sound like the works of darkness? Or do they sound like the stubborn brilliance of humanity, refusing to be extinguished even in hardship? The myth of 1,000 years of silence ignores the voices that never stopped singing. Music filled. Churches, lutes and flutes accompanied village dances. Troubadours carried songs of love and war from castle to castle. Color-decorated manuscripts with gold and lapis blue painted saints and sinners, angels and demons, kings and peasants. The world was not grey, it was illuminated. To deny this is to look back with eyes half closed. Why then do we still call it dark? Perhaps because we are addicted to stories of progress that need villains. The Middle Ages became the scapegoat, the foil, the shadow against which modernity could call itself brilliant. But shadows are only shadows because light is near. The people of those centuries did not see themselves as dark. They prayed, they studied, they built, they celebrated. Their world was alive, not asleep. And maybe this is the deeper lesson. When we label an age as dark, we not only insult the past, we also blind ourselves to its resilience. The truth is that darkness and light are never separate. They exist together. The Middle Ages had war, plague, ignorance, yes, but so too did they have faith, endurance, creativity, and joy. To call it only darkness is to ignore half the story. Close your eyes and picture a monk, bent over his page, preserving words that would outlive him by centuries. Picture a mason, carving stone that would rise into a cathedral arch. Picture a mother, telling stories to her children by firelight, ensuring memory survived in voices even when pages burned. Picture a farmer planting seeds after war had trampled his fields, refusing to let despair claim the earth. These were the people of the Dark Ages. Their light was fragile, but it was real, and because they carried it, we inherit it still. The Middle Ages were not a void, they were a bridge, and bridges are not dark, they are passageways, built so that life can move forward. So the next time you hear someone call it a dark age, remember light was always there, carried in hands, in hearts, in voices. Their world was not darkness, it was endurance. And endurance is its own kind of brilliance. When we think of the medieval world, a picture often comes to mind. A land where thought was forbidden, where the church silenced every question, where no one dared to imagine beyond scripture. We are told that the Middle Ages were 1,000 years of intellectual silence, a desert where curiosity dried up and reason was chained. But that picture, though painted often, is not true. The reality is that medieval minds were far from silent. They wrestled with questions of the soul and the stars, the law and the body, ethics and mathematics. They built schools, then universities that shaped the very idea of education we still carry. To call them ignorant is to erase the brilliance that bloomed in unlikely soil. The first universities were born in the Middle Ages. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, names still spoken today, began then as places where scholars gathered, debated, and taught. What did they study? Theology, yes, but also law, medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, grammar, logic, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. These subjects, known as the liberal arts, were not trivial. They were the framework of thought, the tools by which a mind was trained. To master them was to prepare to think deeply, to argue well, to understand the order of the cosmos. Far from a desert, the medieval world was a garden of questions. Think of the great figures who walked those halls. Thomas Aquinas, wrestling with how faith and reason could coexist. Abelard, debating ethics and morality with fiery passion. Hildegard of Bingen, writing music and medicine, visions and theology, a woman whose voice carried beyond convent walls. These were not minds asleep. They were minds on fire, searching for truth in a world often uncertain. Their methods may seem foreign to us now, but their desire was the same as ours, to know, to understand, to make sense of the mystery of life. And what of science? Medieval scholars studied the heavens, charting stars and planets, building upon ancient knowledge. They did not yet have telescopes, but they had eyes, and they used them. They studied medicine, often with flawed theories, but also with herbs, surgeries, and practical remedies that saved lives. They calculated with numbers, experimented with mechanics, devised tools that made life easier. To dismiss it all as ignorance is to ignore the roots of our own knowledge. The Renaissance did not appear out of nowhere. It grew from seeds planted in the medieval soil. Even the act of copying texts, so often mocked as mere repetition, was itself a kind of scholarship. To copy was to preserve was to transmit, and to transmit was to keep knowledge alive. The monks in their scriptoria did not merely recite words. They engaged with them, commented on them, debated their meanings in the margins. Every page carried not only the text, but the mind of the one who copied it. Their work was not silence, but dialogue across centuries. The myth of ignorance also ignores the wisdom found in daily life. Farmers knew soil and seasons with a precision that modern machines have dulled in us. Healers knew herbs, midwives guided births, blacksmiths mastered fire and metal, masons shaped stone into arches that still stand. Was their knowledge written in books? Not always, but knowledge lived in hands as much as in minds. To call them ignorant because their wisdom was not ours is arrogance. They knew what their world required, and they passed that knowledge forward in ways that built survival. And then there is the myth that the church silenced all thought. Certainly the church had power, and it used it to control, to censor, to shape ideas. But it also created the very structures of learning that made universities possible. Theology may have been the queen of sciences, but it did not forbid the study of other fields. In fact, it demanded them. To understand law was to govern well. To understand medicine was to heal the body God had made. To understand astronomy was to read the heavens as his clock. Faith was not always a cage. Sometimes it was the framework within which questions could grow. We must remember, too, that knowledge has always been fragile. In every age, including ours, there are limits to what is allowed, to what is believed, to what is known. We laugh at the medievals for their superstitions, but what of our own? We call them ignorant for believing in humors and bloodletting. But what will future generations laugh at in us? Ignorance is not unique to them. It is part of humanity, and just as we are more than our mistakes, so were they. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval classroom. Students sit on wooden benches, listening to a master speak. He reads from Aristotle, then pauses to question. The students argue, debate, ask. They take notes on parchment, struggling with ink and quills. Outside, bells ring for prayer, but inside, minds wrestle with ideas older than their grandfathers. This is not silence, this is the noise of learning, the hum of thought, the fire of curiosity. It is not the picture of ignorance, but of endurance, knowledge carried forward in fragile vessels. And imagine also the quieter lessons outside the halls of universities. A blacksmith teaching his apprentice how to read the glow of metal, when to strike, when to cool. A mother teaching her daughter which herbs ease a fever, which soothe a cough. A shepherd teaching his son the stars, not for wonder, but for navigation. These too were classrooms. These too were universities. Knowledge is not always written, it is lived, and in living it survives. So let us be cautious when we speak of ignorance. The Middle Ages was not a blank space on history's page. It was a chapter full of struggle, yes, but also of thought. The people of that time were not empty vessels waiting for the Renaissance to wake them. They were awake, in their own way, in their own world, with their own questions. And perhaps their greatest gift to us is this. They remind us that curiosity can endure even in hardship, that knowledge can survive even in silence, that wisdom is not only in the future, but also in the past. The myth of ignorance falls apart. When we listen to their voices, see their buildings, read their books, trace their inventions, they were not dark, they were searching, they were not silent. They were speaking in tongues we have forgotten how to hear. So the next time someone calls the Middle Ages ignorant, remember the monk writing by candlelight, the scholar debating in Paris, the mason shaping a cathedral arch, the midwife guiding life into the world. Remember that they too were teachers, learners, seekers. Remember that ignorance was not their destiny, and it is not ours. When people speak of the Middle Ages, one shadow looms larger than all others: the Church. For many, the medieval Church is remembered only as a tyrant, a force that silenced thought, chained knowledge, burned dissenters, and smothered all curiosity beneath the weight of dogma. The very phrase Dark Ages often implies that religion extinguished reason for 1,000 years. But is that the full truth? Was the Church only an oppressor? Or was it also, paradoxically, the very institution that preserved, carried, and even cultivated the seeds of learning that would bloom long after its own grip weakened? The truth is complex, as truth always is. The Church was indeed powerful, often overbearing, sometimes violent in its defense of orthodoxy. It silenced voices it feared, punished those who strayed too far, and wrapped much of daily life in ritual and authority. And yet it was also the Church that kept alive countless manuscripts, that founded universities, that commissioned art and architecture of astonishing beauty, that gave Europe its first libraries. To dismiss it as only a cage is to forget that even cages can sometimes carry fragile birds across storms. In monasteries scattered across Europe, monks bent over parchment with quills, copying not only sacred texts, but also the writings of ancient philosophers, poets, and physicians. Aristotle, Cicero, Galen, Virgil, these voices would have been silenced by time had they not been preserved in scriptoria, where silence was prayer and writing was devotion. The monks did not always understand the treasures they copied, and sometimes they condemned what they preserved, but still they preserved it. The Renaissance, so often celebrated as a rebirth, was in truth a rediscovery of texts that had survived precisely because the Church had carried them through the centuries. To call the Church only an enemy of knowledge is to erase this quiet labor of memory. The cathedrals, too, were not monuments of ignorance. They were books of stone and glass, written in geometry and light. Every arch was calculation, every stained glass window a theology of color. The builders were not mindless laborers, but craftsmen who married faith with science, art with devotion. To walk into Chartres or Notre Dame was to walk into a universe carefully designed to teach, to inspire, to lift eyes and minds upward. Far from smothering imagination, the church often commissioned its highest flights. And what of universities? They were born from church soil. Bologna, Paris, Oxford. Their roots were in cathedral schools, their teachers often clerics, their subjects, bound at first by theology. But they did not remain only that. Law, medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, astronomy, all were studied within those walls. The church may have tried to hold the leash, but curiosity strained against it, and often it was allowed to wander farther than we assume. Aquinas, Abelard, Hildegard, Albertus Magnus, their works were not silence but dialogue, wrestling with faith and reason, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in harmony. This is not to deny the church's cruelties. It did burn heretics. It did silence voices that questioned too deeply. It did bind thought within limits that to us seem narrow. Yet even here, the story is not one of pure darkness. For within those limits, minds still moved, still debated, still sought meaning. And often those who were silenced still found ways to echo across centuries. The church's attempts to suppress were never absolute. Its grip was strong, but never unbreakable. The myth of a church that killed all knowledge also ignores the reality of faith itself for medieval people. For them, belief was not a cage, but a lifeline. In a world of famine, plague, and war, faith offered meaning where reason could not. Prayers were not only superstition, they were acts of courage in the face of despair. Pilgrimages were not only rituals, they were journeys of endurance and hope. The church's power was not only oppression, it was also comfort. To dismiss that is to forget that the human heart seeks not only knowledge, but also consolation. Even the Inquisition, so often remembered as a symbol of absolute tyranny, was more complicated than the caricature. It was harsh, unjust, and cruel, but it was also legalistic, structured, and in some cases less arbitrary than secular justice of the time. This does not excuse it, but it reminds us that history rarely offers us pure villains. The church was human, flawed, fragile, capable of both cruelty and care, and perhaps that is the greatest lesson. To call the medieval church only an oppressor is to fall into the same trap as those who called the whole age dark. The truth is more fragile, more human. The church preserved even as it suppressed. It inspired even as it limited. It consoled even as it controlled. It was both guardian and jailer, midwife and judge. Close your eyes and imagine a monk in a cold stone room, copying Aristotle by candlelight. He does not agree with every word, but he writes it anyway, line by line, ensuring it will not be lost. Imagine a mason carving stone for a cathedral arch, his hands guided by geometry he cannot name, but instinctively understands. Imagine a teacher in Paris, lecturing on logic, while his students argue, question, laugh. Imagine a peasant lighting a candle before a statue, whispering prayers not out of fear, but out of longing. These too were the Middle Ages. Not only silence, but voices. Not only chains, but bridges. The myth of the church as pure oppressor robs us of these truths. It tempts us into arrogance, into believing we are free of the flaws they bore. Yet we too have institutions that silence, that control, that preserve, that inspire. The mirror of history shows us not only their failings, but our own. So let us not call the medieval church only a tyrant. Let us see it as it was. Vast, flawed, powerful, fragile, capable of cruelty, but also of preservation. Let us honor the paradox that the same institution that silenced voices also carried voices across centuries. For in that paradox lies a lesson for us, that light can survive even when carried in imperfect hands, and perhaps that is the truest gift of those centuries. Not that the church was perfect, but that within its imperfection, knowledge endured. And if knowledge could endure then, in such fragile vessels, perhaps it can endure now, even in ours. When modern people imagine the Middle Ages, one image rises above all others: filth. We are told they never bathed, that they stank of sweat and mud, that their teeth rotted while they laughed with empty mouths. We imagine medieval cities as piles of waste, with chamber pots dumped into streets, with rats crawling everywhere, with disease born from dirt alone. The stereotype is so strong that the phrase, "the dirty Middle Ages," is almost a proverb. But once again, the truth is not so simple. To reduce centuries of life to caricature is to forget that medieval people cared for their bodies, their health, and their dignity, even if their ways differed from ours. Bathing, for instance, was not forgotten. Public bathhouses thrived in many towns during the early and high Middle Ages, often inspired by Roman models. In Paris, London, and countless smaller cities, bathhouses served not only as places of hygiene, but of social gathering. Families, merchants, even clergy visited them. Soap made from animal fat and lye was widely used. Herbs were added for fragrance, and hot water was valued not just for comfort, but for health. True, in later centuries, concerns about morality and disease caused some bathhouses to close, but the idea that medieval people never bathed is a distortion. They washed in rivers, in wooden tubs, in public baths. Cleanliness was seen not only as pleasant, but as virtuous. Teeth, too, were not neglected. Archaeological remains show that many medieval people had better teeth than modern people today. Without sugar flooding their diets, cavities were less common. Mouth rinses made of herbs, mint, and even wine were used. Chewing sticks and cloths helped clean teeth. Manuals of etiquette advised washing the mouth and avoiding bad breath. They did not have dentists as we do, but they cared, they tried, they managed. Clothing was also washed more often than the myth suggests. Linen shirts and undergarments, worn close to the skin, absorbed sweat and were frequently laundered. Laundry was hard work, but it was done, often communally at riversides or in town laundries. Smell was not ignored. Perfumes and scented waters, distilled from roses, lavender, rosemary, and sage, were popular among the wealthy. Even the poor, though unable to afford perfumes, used herbs for freshness. To imagine them drowning in filth is to underestimate their awareness and their pride. And what of medicine? Here too the myths are cruel. We laugh at the image of leeches, at bloodletting, at prayers for healing. But medieval medicine, though often mixed with superstition, also carried real knowledge. Herbal remedies abounded: willow bark for pain, garlic for infections, mint for digestion. Monastic gardens cultivated dozens of medicinal plants, their properties noted in manuscripts. Midwives, though later vilified, carried wisdom about childbirth that saved countless lives. Barber surgeons performed amputations, stitched wounds, set bones. Did they lack anesthesia and germ theory? Yes, but they worked with what they had, and often it was enough. The Black Death, so often cited as proof of their ignorance, also reveals their resilience. Cities instituted quarantines, closing ports and roads. Families burned incense, fumigated homes, practiced forms of isolation. They did not understand bacteria, but they sensed contagion. Their actions were clumsy, sometimes desperate, but they were attempts to survive against something unseen. And isn't that the same as us? Even now, when new diseases appear, we scramble, we guess, we fight with limited tools. To mock their struggle is to forget that they too were human, doing their best in the face of the unknown. Hygiene extended beyond the body to the home and the city. Town councils passed laws about waste disposal, street cleaning and water supply. Wells and fountains were maintained. Markets regulated spoiled food. True, not all was effective, and poverty made filth unavoidable for many, but effort was constant. To imagine them indifferent to filth is to insult their intelligence. They lived close to death. They understood the value of cleanliness, even if their science was incomplete. Even attitudes toward the body itself were not crude. The medieval world saw the body as both fragile and sacred. Medical texts treated it with reverence, seeking balance between humors, harmony between elements. Religious texts warned against vanity, yes, but they also valued health as a divine gift. Cleanliness in many traditions was linked to holiness. To wash was not only to refresh, but to purify. The body, though mortal, was a vessel of the soul, and to care for it was to honor God. The myth of filth persists because it comforts us. We imagine ourselves superior, enlightened, advanced. But perhaps the truer lesson is humility, for even with our technology, our sanitized homes, our medicine, we too are vulnerable. Pandemics remind us that cleanliness is fragile. Pollution reminds us that filth is not only theirs, but ours. And when we laugh at their supposed dirt, we might ask, will those who come after laugh at us in the same way? Close your eyes and imagine a medieval morning. A woman draws water from a well, washing her children's faces with a cloth scented faintly of lavender. A man visits the public bath, steam rising as he scrubs with soap made by local hands. A midwife tends to a mother in childbirth, whispering prayers, but also giving herbs to ease pain. A monk prepares ointment from rosemary and sage, treating the sick of his village. This is the Middle Ages too. Not filth, but care. Not ignorance, but effort. Not apathy, but dignity. And here is the final truth. Their hygiene was not ours, but it was theirs, shaped by their world, their tools, their fears, their hopes. To erase it under the label of filth is to deny their humanity. Better to see them as they were, fragile, yes, but striving, always striving, to live clean, to live healthy, to live with dignity. The lesson for us is simple. Do not dismiss the past with arrogance. Learn from it with humility. For if they, with so little, cared so much for life, how much more should we, with so much, honor the gift of our bodies, our health, our world? When people hear the words Middle Ages, one of the darkest images that often comes to mind is that of witches being dragged to pyres, tied to stakes, burned in roaring flames while crowds shouted and priests chanted. We are told that medieval Europe was obsessed with witchcraft, that women were persecuted by the thousands, that fire and fear consumed the night. But here again, the story we repeat is not the whole truth. The great witch hunts, the mass burnings, the thousands of deaths, they did not belong to the medieval world. They belonged to the early modern period, centuries later. To confuse the two is to misplace fear and to miss the more complex reality of the medieval mind. Yes, there were accusations of witchcraft in the Middle Ages. Yes, some trials occurred. And yes, individuals were punished, sometimes with death. But these were relatively rare, isolated, and usually tied more to heresy or local fears than to organized large-scale hunts. In fact, for much of the medieval period, the official church did not even believe that witches as popularly imagined, people flying on broomsticks, casting curses with the devil's help, truly existed. Many church authorities dismissed such beliefs as superstition. To believe in witches, they argued, was itself heretical, a denial of God's ultimate power. The mass hysteria, the thousands executed in waves of fear, came later, in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. It was in the modern era, not the medieval, that manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum spread the idea of witchcraft as an organized conspiracy against Christendom. It was then that courts hunted women and men by the hundreds, that paranoia burned across Germany, Switzerland, Scotland, and beyond. By then, printing presses spread fear faster than ever, and political, social, and religious upheavals poured fuel on the fire. But in the centuries we call medieval, witch hunting was not a defining feature of life. So why do we imagine otherwise? Perhaps because the Middle Ages has been painted as a time of fear, of shadows, of ignorance. To place witch burnings there makes the caricature complete. We like to think of ourselves as more rational, more enlightened, so we exaggerate their fears and silence our own. But the truth is, the medieval world's relationship with magic was more complicated than simple terror. For medieval people, magic was part of the spectrum of belief. There was natural magic, the use of herbs, charms, and prayers, often tolerated and even respected. There were healers, midwives, cunning folk who treated illness, guided births, blessed crops. Some saw them as suspicious, others as essential. Boundaries between medicine, religion, and magic were blurred. Was a prayer against fever a spell or a blessing? Was a herb against pain medicine or sorcery? For them, the categories were not so rigid as ours. Life was lived in shades of grey, not in black and white. Even when accusations arose, they were often personal, born from disputes between neighbours or from tragedies seeking explanation. A failed harvest, a sick child, a dying cow. In times of despair, blame needed a face. Sometimes that face was a widow, sometimes a healer, sometimes simply someone different. Fear has always needed scapegoats. But in the medieval world, these fears remained local, not systemic. The machinery of mass persecution had not yet been built. What we learn from this myth is not only a correction of history, but a reflection of ourselves. For the witch hunts that came later remind us of how fragile reason can be when fear reigns. And the smaller, quieter accusations of the medieval period remind us that human communities, in their pain, have always been tempted to cast blame rather than endure uncertainty. Do we not still do the same? In times of crisis, how often do we search for someone to accuse, someone to punish, rather than accepting the weight of chance, of fate, of nature? But there is another truth too. Even in those times, courage endured. Some defended the accused, stood against superstition, refused to condemn without proof. Some healers continued their work, blessing and treating despite suspicion. Some communities resisted fear, choosing trust over blame. And in their courage, we see the resilience of humanity, the refusal to let fear dictate all. Close your eyes and imagine not only the pyres, but also the quieter realities. A woman gathering herbs at dawn, whispering prayers as she prepares. Remedies, a neighbor knocking at her door, seeking help for a fevered child. Gratitude more common than suspicion, trust more common than betrayal. This too was the Middle Ages. Not only fire, but healing. Not only fear, but faith. To believe that thousands of witches burned in medieval squares is to confuse centuries, to let prejudice distort memory. The truth is subtler, but also more human. Fear existed, but so did resilience. Suspicion whispered, but trust endured. Death came, but not in the waves we imagine. And perhaps the greatest lesson here is this: myths of fear can be as dangerous as fear itself. When we believe the past was only terror, we blind ourselves to its courage. And when we tell stories of others as hysterical, we forget our own capacity for hysteria. The witch hunts of the modern era, the small accusations of the medieval, both remind us that humanity must always choose fear or trust, blame or endurance. The Middle Ages was not a furnace of witches. It was a world of fragile people seeking meaning, sometimes wrongly, sometimes wisely, always human. To honor them is to see them fully, not through the smoke of myths. And so, tonight, let us lay that myth to rest. The fires of the great hunts did not belong to them. They belonged to another age, another fear. The medieval world carried its own shadows, yes, but also its own lights. And in those lights, we see not only the past, but the same choice we face. Will we let fear consume us, or will we endure with courage? When the word medieval is spoken, most people imagine shadows, war, famine, plague, suffering. And yes, those shadows were real. The Middle Ages carried hardship that pressed heavily on every life. But to imagine the medieval world as only sorrow is to miss its heartbeat. For even in the hardest centuries, people laughed, people sang, people celebrated. They held festivals in the depths of winter, feasts after harvest, weddings that filled entire villages with dancing. They cooked meals that nourished not just the body but the spirit. They loved, they played, they told stories by firelight. The myth that they lived only in despair blinds us to the resilience of joy. For the truth is this: even when darkness surrounded them, they chose to celebrate life. Festivals were woven into the medieval calendar like bright threads in a dark tapestry. The church calendar alone filled the year with holy days that were also holidays. Christmas and Easter were celebrated with pageantry, food, music. Saints' feast days became excuses for markets, fairs, and gatherings. Carnival exploded in laughter. Before the quiet of Lent, villages held harvest festivals with bonfires, dancing, and games. For peasants who labored hard, these feasts were moments of reprieve, reminders that life was not only toil, but also celebration. Laughter rang as loud as church bells, carrying through fields and streets. Music was everywhere. It was not reserved for nobles or churches alone. Minstrels traveled from town to town, singing tales of love and war. In villages, lutes, fiddles, and flutes accompanied dances. Drums and simple pipes filled nights with rhythm. Even in monasteries, chants rose like waves, filling stone walls with harmony. Music was not a luxury, it was a necessity, a way of binding community, of lifting spirits, of making the soul remember beauty. The myth of silence and gloom cannot survive when we hear the echoes of their songs. Food, too, carried joy. Though famine was feared and scarcity real, when harvests were good, tables were filled. Bread was the staple, dark rye for the poor, white wheat for the rich. But it was accompanied by cheese, eggs, vegetables, herbs. Meat appeared on special days: pork, chicken, venison for the lucky. Fish filled diets, especially in coastal regions and during fasts. Feasts were occasions of abundance, with roasted meats, spiced dishes, sweetened pastries, wine, and ale. And the sharing of food was not only nourishment, but community. To break bread together was to affirm life. Love and affection also belonged to their world. The myth paints medieval marriages as cold contracts, devoid of tenderness. Yet letters, poems, and songs reveal otherwise. Courtly love may have been an idealized form, but it expressed longing, devotion, vulnerability. Husbands and wives laughed together, parents cherished children, friends drank and embraced. The human heart did not wait for modernity to learn to love. It beat as warmly then as now. Stories bound communities together. At night, by firelight, tales were told of saints, of heroes, of tricksters. Some were moral lessons, others were pure entertainment. Children listened wide-eyed, adults laughed knowingly. In noble courts, troubadours spun romances of knights and ladies. In villages, folk tales carried wisdom from ancestors. Stories gave meaning, gave escape, gave joy. They reminded people that even in hardship, imagination could still soar. Games and play were not forgotten either. Children played with dolls, carved toys, balls and hoops. Adults played dice, chess, and backgammon. Village greens hosted contests, wrestling, archery, races. Tournaments filled noble courts with spectacle, dangerous, yes, but also celebratory. Play was not luxury, but necessity. It was the soul's way of breathing. Even humor was alive. Jesters entertained courts with satire. Minstrels sang comic songs. Peasants told bawdy jokes. Manuscripts are filled with doodles and caricatures, monks scribbling playful drawings in the margins of holy texts. Joy slipped in through cracks, even in solemn places. For laughter was not weakness, it was survival. To imagine the medieval world without these joys is to misunderstand resilience. Joy is not denial of suffering, it is its antidote. To laugh at a wedding after burying a neighbor, to feast after famine, to sing after war, these were acts of courage. Celebration was resistance against despair. Their joy was not naive, it was defiant. And perhaps that is the lesson we most need. In our own lives, we often wait for perfect peace before celebrating. But the medieval world reminds us that joy does not wait. It blooms in hardship, insists on laughter even when surrounded by tears. They chose to live even when death was near. They chose to feast even when famine threatened. They chose to dance even when war scarred their fields. Close your eyes and imagine it. A village square lit by torches, musicians play as couples, dance. Children chase each other, laughter echoing. A pig roasts over fire, bread is shared, mugs of ale passed hand to hand. For one night, sorrow is forgotten, and life is enough. This was the Middle Ages too. Not only suffering, but celebration. Not only darkness, but light. So let us not remember them only for their shadows. Let us honor their joy as well. For in their joy lies their greatest resilience, and in their resilience lies our inheritance. One of the most enduring myths about the Middle Ages is that childhood did not exist, that children were treated as little adults, given no special care, no affection, no place of their own. According to this view, medieval parents did not love deeply because death was too common. Children labored as soon as they could walk, carrying burdens beyond their years. Play, tenderness, and the idea of innocence were unknown. It is a bleak picture, and one that makes us feel comfortably superior. But is it true? The evidence tells another story. Yes, medieval children often faced hardships we can hardly imagine. Infant mortality was high, disease common, safety fragile. Many did begin work early, helping in fields, workshops, or homes. But to leap from hardship to the claim that childhood itself did not exist is to erase the care, affection, and joy that surrounded young lives. Parents loved their children. We see it in letters, in lullabies, in wills, where mothers left treasures to sons and daughters, in tears recorded when children died. To suggest otherwise is to strip them of their humanity. Medieval art is filled with images of children, not just as small adults, but as beloved figures. Paintings of the Virgin and Child dominate, yes, but beyond symbolism, we find playful details. Toddlers tugging at robes, infants reaching for toys, children nestled in parents' arms. Manuscripts include drawings of games, children chasing hoops, playing with dolls, flying kites. Archaeology uncovers toys, carved wooden horses, clay figurines, balls, spinning tops. These were not objects for adults, but for children. Childhood was recognized, lived, and celebrated. Education, too, was valued. Noble families trained sons in arms and governance, but they also taught reading, writing, and courtly behavior. Daughters were educated in household management, song, sometimes letters, sometimes more. In towns, children attended song schools, grammar schools, apprentice workshops, where learning was hands-on. Even among peasants, children were taught orally. Prayers, traditions, farming skills, craft knowledge. Childhood was not ignored, it was guided. Play was essential. Medieval texts described games similar to tag, ball games, even primitive forms of soccer. Festivals often included children in dances and pageants. Some games were rough, some innocent, but they existed and they mattered. Play was not wasted time. It was part of growing. To imagine a world without laughter of children is to forget that joy has always been humanity's birthright. What about the claim that parents were detached because death was so common? It is true that many children died young, and grief was frequent, but far from being cold, parents often grieved deeply. Letters record sorrow, poems lament lost sons and daughters, tombs were carved with images of children taken too soon. If anything, love may have been sharper because life was fragile. The myth of indifference is a modern projection, born from the false idea that past hearts were harder than ours. But grief has always been grief. Love has always been love. Even spiritually, childhood carried meaning. Baptism marked infants as part of the Christian community. Saints' lives often included visions of holy children, their innocence celebrated as closer to God. The figure of Christ as child was central, a reminder that even divinity passed through infancy. Childhood was not dismissed, it was sacred. Daily, life for children was a balance of work and play, learning and laughter, danger and protection. They helped with chores, yes, tending animals, carrying water, gathering herbs, but they also played in fields, sang songs, made up stories. Families protected them as best they could, teaching caution but also joy. Childhood was not the same as ours, but it was real and it was valued. The myth of the mini-adult erases this reality. It comforts us into thinking we invented love for children, that only modernity cherishes innocence. But love is older than history. Parents have always held children close, always longed for their safety, always dreamed of their future. Medieval parents were no different. Close your eyes and picture it. A mother rocks her child by firelight, singing a lullaby passed from her own mother. A father carves a wooden horse, giving it to his son with a smile. Children run through a village square, chasing each other, their laughter echoing against stone walls. A teacher guides students in a grammar school, children struggling with their letters but determined to learn. A family mourns a child lost, tears falling on a small carved tomb. These are the Middle Ages too, not coldness, but care, not absence, but presence, not indifference, but love. The lesson is clear. Myths often make us arrogant. We imagine we are the first to value children, the first to love deeply, the first to grieve profoundly. But humanity has always carried these truths. To see medieval childhood honestly is to be humbled, for even in a world harsher than ours, they nurtured joy, tenderness, and hope. The next time someone says medieval children were only mini-adults, remember their toys, their games, their lullabies. Remember their laughter. Remember their parents' tears. Remember that love is older than time, and childhood has always been real. When most people think of the Middle Ages, they picture swords clashing endlessly, knights charging across muddy fields, peasants trembling under the weight of warlords, and blood staining every stone. Violence is seen as the language of that. Time, as if law, order, and peace had vanished. We imagine a world where justice was nothing but cruelty, where every dispute ended in blood, where life was nasty, brutish, and short. But this image, though dramatic, is not the full truth. Yes, violence was real, but violence is real in every age. What the myth ignores is the quieter reality, that medieval society was held together not only by swords, but by bonds of trust, oaths, mediation, and community. Medieval justice was not simply about punishment, it was about restoring peace. When a crime was committed, the goal was often not just to punish the guilty, but to restore balance between families, neighbors, and communities. Compensation, known as vergeld in earlier centuries, was one way to achieve this. Rather than spilling more blood, offenders paid fines, sometimes in money, sometimes in goods, to repair the harm done. Was this perfect justice? No. It often favored the wealthy, who could afford to pay. But it shows that the impulse was not only toward revenge, but toward resolution. Oaths played a central role. Swearing loyalty, swearing innocence, swearing to tell the truth, words bound people in ways that law alone could not. To break an oath was not only a legal offense, but a spiritual one, a violation of honor and of God's witness. Communities relied on oaths as glue, trusting that words spoken under sacred watch carried weight. In many trials, character witnesses stood for the accused, affirming their trustworthiness. Justice was not just in the sword or the dungeon, it was in the bonds of word and reputation. Mediation was common. Disputes between neighbors, quarrels over land, even feuds between families were often resolved not by endless fighting, but by negotiation. Lords, priests, or community elders acted as mediators, guiding sides toward peace. Documents survive where enemies swore peace agreements, sealed by ritual gestures, a handshake, a kiss, the sharing of bread and wine. These rituals were not empty. They were visible signs that peace had been restored, that violence would not continue. The myth of endless brutality erases this constant striving for peace. Communities themselves were strong forces of order. In towns, guilds regulated trades, set standards and resolved disputes. In villages, councils of elders or assemblies made decisions. Even among peasants, mutual aid bound people together, shared work in harvest, shared defense against raiders, shared care in sickness. Life was fragile, but fragility demanded cooperation. To imagine only violence is to forget how much of life was sustained by trust. Of course, violence did exist. Wars erupted, raids struck, punishments could be harsh. Executions and mutilations were real, but we must remember scale. Most people lived their daily lives not in battlefields, but in homes, markets, fields, and churches. They feared violence, yes, but they also feared disorder. Peace was not absent, it was pursued, guarded, cherished. Even nights, so often remembered, only for bloodshed, were shaped by ideals of restraint. Chivalry may not have always been practiced, but it was taught that the strong should protect the weak, that war should have rules, that honor mattered. Was it often broken? Yes. But the very existence of such a code shows that medieval people longed for justice even in the midst of violence. They dreamed of order even when chaos threatened. Religion, too, played a role in tempering violence. The Peace and Truce of God movements, beginning in the 10th century, sought to limit war, forbidding fighting on holy days, protecting non-combatants, establishing sanctuaries. Were these always obeyed? No. But they reveal that even in times of conflict, there was awareness that violence needed boundaries. Humanity has always struggled to contain its darker impulses, and the medieval world was no exception. The myth of endless violence also ignores the rhythms of reconciliation. When blood was shed, communities sought to heal. Feasts marked peace treaties. Marriages were arranged to unite families once divided. Churches hosted ceremonies of forgiveness. These were not minor moments. They were the heart of survival. Without reconciliation, society would have collapsed entirely. The fact that it endured shows that peace was valued as much as strength. Close your eyes and imagine not only battlefields, but quieter scenes. Two neighbors argue over a boundary. A priest steps in, guiding them to compromise. A thief is caught. Instead of execution, he pays compensation, restoring what was taken. A family, after years of feud, shares bread with their rivals in a ritual of peace. A guild resolves a quarrel among its members, restoring trust so work can continue. These are acts of justice too, Not dramatic, but vital. The myth of medieval brutality comforts us by contrast. We tell ourselves we are more civilized, more peaceful, more just. But are we? Wars rage in our own time, prisons overflow, violence persists. If we mock the Middle Ages for their cruelty, perhaps we should first examine our own. History's mirror does not flatter. The truth is that the medieval world was not endless war. It was a world of fragile people trying to build peace in a dangerous time. Violence was real, but so was trust. Punishment was harsh, but so was reconciliation. Cruelty existed, but so did compassion. To remember only the sword is to forget the hand that reached for peace. The lesson is simple but profound. Humanity has always carried both war and peace within itself. The Middle Ages remind us that even in hard times, people longed for justice, sought reconciliation, cherished community. They remind us that peace is not the absence of violence, but the constant work of healing it. So the next time someone says the medieval world was only brutality, remember the oaths sworn, the disputes mediated, the feasts of peace, the hands clasped in reconciliation. Remember that justice then was not only about blood, but about bonds. And perhaps we can learn from them still, that violence may scar, but it does not define, that peace, though fragile, is always possible. When many imagine the Middle Ages, the picture that appears is almost always male. Kings on thrones, knights on horseback, monks in cloisters, merchants in markets. Women seem invisible, erased from memory, hidden behind veils or trapped in silence. The myth says that they had no role, no power, no presence, that they lived only in kitchens or convents, that they had no voices worth hearing. But history, when we listen closely, tells another story. Medieval women were everywhere. In courts, in churches, in markets, in fields. They ruled, they created, they healed, they traded, they prayed, they resisted. To erase them is to betray the fullness of the past. Consider queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was not only a consort, but a political force, shaping alliances, funding armies, guiding culture. She accompanied crusades, governed lands, and influenced two kingdoms, France and England. Or Blanche of Castile, who ruled France as regent, with wisdom and strength, defending her son's throne against rebellion. These women were not silent shadows. They were leaders whose decisions shaped nations. In the church, too, women held power. Abbesses governed monasteries with authority equal to male counterparts, managing lands, overseeing education, producing texts. Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess, wrote music that still stirs souls, visions that challenge the powerful, works of science and medicine that endure. She was consulted by emperors and popes. Her voice rang across Europe, proof that female wisdom could not be silenced. Art and literature also bore women's touch. Women composed songs, wrote poetry, illuminated manuscripts. The Troberites of Occitania sang of love and loss with as much passion as their male troubadour counterparts. Christine de Pizan, writing at the dawn of the 15th century, defended women against misogyny in her Book of the City of Ladies, creating a symbolic city where female worth was honored. These voices prove that women not only participated in culture, they shaped it. Commerce, too, relied on women. In towns, women ran shops, brewed ale, wove cloth, sold goods in markets. Some became wealthy merchants in their own right, managing accounts, negotiating contracts. Guilds sometimes admitted widows to continue their husbands' trades, and many women proved skilled entrepreneurs. In villages, women's labor was constant, tending animals, gathering herbs, planting, harvesting. Without their work, survival itself would have collapsed. And what of medicine? Women were healers, midwives, nurses. They carried knowledge of herbs, childbirth, and remedies, often passed down through generations. Their hands guided life into the world Their wisdom soothed sickness. Their presence gave comfort in death. Later centuries would brand many of them witches, but in the Middle Ages they were trusted. Communities depended on them. Even in law, women were not entirely absent. They could inherit property, manage estates, represent families in disputes. Noble women often governed lands in their husband's absence, signing documents, dispensing justice, protecting castles. Peasant women defended fields and homes when men were away at war. Their voices may not have been as loud in chronicles, but their hands left fingerprints on history. The myth of female absence survives because chronicles were often written by men for men about men. But the silences of records do not mean silences in life. Archaeology uncovers jewelry, tools, clothing, artifacts of women's daily presence. Manuscripts record prayers in female hands. Tombstones remember mothers, daughters, wives with tenderness. Their lives were real, their impact lasting. To say medieval women had no agency is not only false, it is unjust. They fought within limits, yes, but they fought. They endured structures of patriarchy, but within them, they carved space for influence, for dignity, for survival. Their stories remind us that power is not always in crowns or swords. Sometimes it is in the persistence of work, the resilience of care, the courage of words. Close your eyes and imagine them. A queen addressing lords, her voice firm, her will unshaken. An abbess in her cloister writing visions by candlelight. A merchant woman at her stall counting coins, bargaining with sharp wit. A peasant woman gathering herbs at dawn, whispering prayers over her child. A midwife guiding new life into the world, hands steady, heart strong. These were the women of the Middle Ages. Unseen in myths but vivid in truth, the myth of their absence comforts us with a lie. That progress began only when modernity arrived, when we gave women voices. But women have always had voices. The question is whether we choose to hear them. The Middle Ages whispers loudly when we listen. Women were here, they mattered, they endured, their courage is a lesson for us. Even within structures that limited them, they created, ruled, healed, and inspired. They remind us that resilience is not only breaking chains, but also surviving within them, turning narrow paths into roads of endurance. So the next time someone says women in the Middle Ages were invisible, remember Eleanor, Blanche, Hildegard, Christine. Remember the unnamed mothers and healers, the merchants and peasants. Remember their songs, their work, their prayers, their laughter, for they were not shadows, they were light. One of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages is that it was a time of isolation, that villages were cut off from the world, towns closed in on themselves, kingdoms blind to distant lands. We are told that medieval Europe was stagnant, sealed like a chest locked away, unaware of the wider world. But this picture is wrong. The medieval world was not a closed box. It was a web of roads, rivers, seas, and skies connecting people, goods, and ideas across vast distances. It was not isolation, but movement, not silence, but exchange. Trade bound medieval Europe together and reached far beyond it. Markets filled towns with spices from the east, silks from Byzantium, furs from the north, salt from the south. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa thrived on maritime commerce, sending ships across the Mediterranean, connecting with North Africa, the Levant, and beyond. Flanders wove cloth that was traded everywhere. Hanseatic merchants linked ports of the Baltic and North Seas into a network of wealth and influence. To imagine medieval Europe as closed is to forget the caravans, the ships, the wagons constantly on the move. Pilgrimage was another force of connection. Thousands of people traveled to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, Rome in Italy, and countless other shrines. Pilgrimage roads were highways of faith, but also of culture. Inns and hospitals were built along the way. Merchants followed the pilgrims. Stories were exchanged in dozens of tongues. Pilgrims brought back not only blessings, but also songs, fashions, and news. To walk on pilgrimage was to walk through a world that was anything but isolated. Universities, too, were centers of movement. Students traveled from distant lands to study in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Salamanca. Teachers moved as well, carrying ideas across borders. Latin served as a common tongue, allowing debate from Spain to Poland. The intellectual life of Europe was not closed but connected, part of a conversation stretching across regions and centuries. And what of the Crusades? Though they were wars, bloody and tragic, they also became channels of contact. Crusaders brought back not only relics, but also spices, techniques, and knowledge from the Islamic world. Arab science, mathematics, and medicine flowed into Europe through Spain, Sicily, and the Crusader states. Translations of Arabic texts enriched European libraries. Cross-cultural contact was often violent, but it was contact nonetheless. The medieval world was not untouched by the wider globe. It was shaped by it. Travelers proved this too. Marco Polo's journeys to Asia may be the most famous, but he was not alone. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and adventurers crossed borders constantly. Franciscan friars reached as far as the Mongol court. Traders crossed deserts, rivers, and seas, carrying goods and tales. Even if most peasants never traveled far, the world came to them in the form of goods, news, and influences brought by others. Cities thrived on this connectivity. Markets bustled with goods from near and far. Fairs like those of Champagne in France became international events, drawing merchants from across Europe and beyond. Coins circulated widely, and banking houses in Florence and Venice managed networks of credit stretching across the continent. Money itself was proof that isolation was a myth, for it flowed where connections thrived. Even art and architecture reflect this openness. Gothic cathedrals drew techniques from across regions, their stained glass influenced by Byzantine brilliance, their pointed arches inspired by Islamic designs. Music carried echoes of distant modes. Clothing styles shifted as silks, patterns, and dyes traveled from east to west. The medieval world wore its connections on its very body. So why does the myth of isolation endure? Perhaps because it makes the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration appear more revolutionary than they were. To imagine medieval people closed in darkness makes the later ages shine brighter. But the truth is that the seeds of connection had long been planted. Columbus did not invent travel. He extended roads that already existed. The Renaissance did not create contact. It built on centuries of exchange. The medieval world was not a world without horizons. It was a world of shifting horizons, constantly reached and crossed. People feared the unknown, yes, but they also sought it. They dreamed of Jerusalem, of Rome, of shrines, of markets, of distant seas. They were not locked away. They were moving, searching, connecting. Close your eyes and imagine it. A caravan crosses a mountain pass, its bells ringing in the thin air. A ship docks in Venice, unloading spices that fill the air with foreign scent. Pilgrims walk along a dusty road, singing in many languages, sharing bread and stories by firelight. Students debate in a university hall, their accents mingling in Latin. Merchants count coins at a fair, their stalls filled with cloth, wine, salt, furs, silk. These are the sounds and sights of the Middle Ages too, not silence, but noise, not isolation, but contact. The myth of isolation robs the past of its richness. It tempts us to believe we invented connection, when in truth, humanity has always been connected. To see the medieval world honestly is to see not walls, but roads, not silence, but voices, not darkness, but light. And perhaps the lesson for us is this, that connection is not new, and it is not guaranteed. It is fragile, built on trust, on roads kept open, on hearts willing to travel. The medieval world reminds us that even in times of war and fear, people reached across borders, carried goods and ideas, sought one another. They remind us that we too must choose isolation or connection, fear or trust, walls or bridges. The Middle Ages chose both at times, but in their bridges, we find our inheritance. When modern people picture the Middle Ages, the colors often drain away. We imagine a world painted in grey. Grey castles, grey clothes, grey streets under grey skies. Films and books have often reinforced this image, muddy peasants trudging through lifeless villages, dim candlelight flickering in bleak halls, stone walls unadorned, lifeless and cold. The myth tells us that medieval life was colorless, that beauty was absent, that art lay dormant until the Renaissance awoke. But this is not the truth. The Middle Ages was not grey. It was alive with color, music, beauty, and imagination. To see it otherwise is to miss one of its greatest gifts. Take the cathedrals, those monumental testaments of faith and engineering. We see them today as majestic but muted, weathered stone, faded statues, solemn arches. But in their own time, they blazed with color. Their walls were painted in vibrant reds, blues, and golds. Statues were decorated, not pale as we see them now, but vividly alive. Stained glass windows, flooded interiors with light in every hue, sunlight transformed into stories, saints glowing in emerald and sapphire, angels dancing in ruby fire. To enter a cathedral then was not to enter shadow, but radiance. The myth of greyness collapses before the truth of their brilliance, and what of manuscripts? Illuminated books were treasures of art, their margins filled with intricate patterns, vivid blues from lapis lazuli, shimmering gold leaf, playful figures, sacred images. Monks and scribes did not settle for dull ink. They poured imagination into every page, turning texts into worlds of light. These manuscripts were not exceptions. They were widespread symbols of devotion and creativity. Each page was a defiance of dullness, a declaration that beauty belonged even in prayer. Clothing, too, was colorful. Nobles wore rich fabrics dyed with bright colors, crimson, violet, deep blue, green. Even peasants, though less adorned, wore dyed wools and linens, enjoying colors like russet, yellow, or soft blues. Festivals filled streets with costumes, masks, and banners. Heraldry covered shields and flags with bold symbols, lions and crosses and flowers, each painted in striking hues. The medieval eye delighted in color, pattern, and display. To say their world was only mud is to close our eyes to their joy. Music filled their lives with beauty as well. Gregorian chant resonated through cloisters, layered polyphony grew in cathedrals, troubadours sang of love and longing, peasants danced to fiddles and pipes in village squares. Instruments carved from wood, bone, and string brought rhythm to feasts and solace to sorrow. Music was not rare, it was constant. It flowed through work, prayer, celebration, and grief. The myth of silence ignores the soundscape of medieval life. Architecture beyond cathedrals also carried beauty. Castles were not only fortresses, but homes, decorated with tapestries, frescoes, carvings. Town halls, markets, and bridges displayed. Craftsmanship, often adorned with sculptures and colors, long faded but once vibrant. Villages, though simple, were not without charm. Wooden beams, painted doors, gardens bright with herbs and flowers. To imagine only bleak mud huts is to erase centuries of lived detail. Even food was decorated with beauty. Feasts included dishes spiced with saffron and cinnamon, colored with herbs, arranged with artistry. Banquets displayed sugar sculptures, roasted meats dressed in bright sauces, pies painted with symbols. Food was not only survival, it was celebration, display, imagination made edible. And beyond material beauty, there was the beauty of imagination. Medieval literature gave us epics and romances, tales of Arthur and his knights, poems of love and loss, allegories filled with symbolism. Mystical visions painted inner worlds in words more vibrant than any pigment. The human longing for beauty was not absent. It burned as fiercely then as now. Why then do we imagine their world as grey? Perhaps because time has stripped away much of its colour. Paint has faded, fabrics rotted, music silenced, voices forgotten. We see only ruins, bones, relics, and we mistake these fragments for the whole. But to look at ruins and call them lifeless is to forget they were once alive. To see faded stone and imagine it was always so is to misjudge history. The myth of greyness also comforts us. We want to believe that beauty was reborn in the Renaissance, that modernity alone gave light to the world. But the truth is, beauty never died. It persisted through the medieval centuries, fragile but fierce, carried in song, paint, fabric, glass, and voice. Close your eyes and imagine it. A cathedral at dawn, light streaming through stained glass, painting the floor in sapphire and ruby, a manuscript opened by candlelight, gold leaf gleaming. A village festival, dancers in colored tunics, banners waving, drums beating. A banquet table with dishes bright with herbs and sauces, laughter filling the hall. A troubadour singing under a castle balcony, his voice carrying into the night. This was the Middle Ages too. Not dullness, but brilliance. The lesson is clear. Do not mistake silence for absence, ruins for lifelessness, faded stone for colorless worlds. The Middle Ages was not grey. It was alive with beauty. Beauty born. Not from abundance, but from longing, from imagination, from resilience. They created art, not because life was easy, but because it was hard, and beauty made it bearable. So the next time someone says the Middle Ages was without beauty, remember the stained glass glowing like fire, the manuscripts shining with gold, the songs echoing in night air. Remember that beauty is not a luxury of peace, but a necessity of survival. And remember that they, like us, sought color against the grayness of life. The Middle Ages is so often remembered through shadows, filth, ignorance, violence, fear. We inherit phrases like the Dark Ages, caricatures of peasants in mud, images of witch burnings and silent churches. But as we have walked through these myths, one truth has become clear. The medieval world was not empty of light. It was filled with endurance, resilience, imagination, and beauty. Its people, though fragile, carried knowledge, faith, art, laughter, and love across centuries of hardship. And what they carried did not vanish. It lives in us still, the final. Myth to dismantle, then, is the idea that the Middle Ages is over. For in countless ways it is not. Its inheritance flows in our laws, our languages, our art, our institutions, even in the myths we still tell. Take law, for example. Medieval Europe built systems of courts, oaths, contracts, and rights that laid foundations for our own. Trial by jury, property law, city charters, many of these grew in the soil of medieval towns. The idea that law was not only the will of kings, but a framework binding rulers and ruled alike, began then. Magna Carta, written in 1215, was not perfect, but it was a seed, a declaration that power had limits, that justice demanded balance. To call the Middle Ages lawless is to ignore this legacy. Education, too, carries medieval roots. Universities, founded in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and elsewhere, still stand today. Their traditions, lectures, disputations, degrees, shaped the very idea of higher learning. Scholasticism, with its endless questions and debates, may seem distant, but its method of reasoning echoes in classrooms still. The myth of ignorance collapses when we realize that our own schools are heirs of their pursuit of knowledge. Language and literature also owe them much. Dante, Chaucer, Christine de Pizan, their work shaped vernaculars, turning spoken tongues into written art. The epics, romances, and songs of the Middle Ages enriched culture, carrying stories that endure. Even our fairy tales often trace roots to medieval storytellers who spun wonder in candlelight. To say they had no imagination is to deny the stories that still shape our dreams. Art and architecture, of course, remain towering inheritances. Gothic cathedrals still rise across Europe, their spires piercing skies, their windows glowing with centuries-old glass. Illuminated manuscripts still gleam in museums, testaments to patience and devotion. Castles, bridges, and town halls still stand, reminders that stone and dream together can outlast centuries. The medieval eye for beauty still shapes our sense of wonder. Religion too, though changed, remains part of our inheritance. Cathedrals still serve, monasteries still pray, pilgrim routes are still walked. Even for those who no longer believe, the structures of thought, the rhythms of festivals, the echoes of chants linger in culture. The church was flawed, yes, but it carried meaning, comfort, and memory across centuries. Without it, much of what we call Western civilization would be unrecognizable. Even daily life, food, clothing, customs connects us back. Recipes from medieval kitchens echo in ours. Herbs, cheeses, breads still carry their traditions. Festivals like Carnival and Christmas, though transformed, retain medieval flavors. The very idea of community celebration, of feast and fast, is part of their gift. And then there is the inheritance of resilience. The medieval world endured famine, plague, war. Whole villages vanished, populations fell, fear reigned. Yet they survived. They built again, planted again, sang again. Their endurance was not perfect. Many lives were lost, many voices silenced. But the fact that we exist proves that they did not give up. To call them hopeless is to dishonor their survival. The myths we have dismantled, that they were dirty, ignorant, brutal, joyless, isolated, reveal something deeper about us. They show that we prefer to believe progress is sudden, that we are vastly superior to those before us. But history humbles us. It shows that every age is mixture of ignorance and wisdom, cruelty and compassion, fear and courage. The Middle Ages was no different, and by seeing them honestly, we see ourselves more clearly. Perhaps the most important inheritance of all is the reminder that light can survive in fragile hands. Monks copying texts in silence, mothers singing to children in famine, masons carving stone with calloused fingers, healers mixing herbs in dark rooms. They carried light. They did not know we would one day stand here looking back. But they carried it anyway for their children, for their faith, for hope itself. And because they did, we are here. Close your eyes and imagine the chain. A monk passes a book to a student, a mother teaches a song to her child, a craftsman builds a bridge that carries travelers, a merchant shares stories from distant lands. Each act small, each fragile. Yet together they weave a thread strong enough to cross centuries. That thread is our inheritance. So the next time someone laughs at the dark ages, remember the light that never went out. Remember the cathedrals blazing with color, the manuscripts shimmering with gold, the festivals filled with laughter, the classrooms buzzing with debate. Remember the women who ruled, the children who played, the healers who healed, the pilgrims who walked. Remember their resilience, their humanity, their courage. The Middle Ages was not an age of darkness. It was an age of survival, of endurance, of creativity in hardship. Its myths blind us, its truth inspires us. For if they could endure their winters, so can we endure ours. If they could carry memory through centuries of fear, so can we carry hope through ours. Their legacy is not only in stone or parchment, but in spirit. A spirit that whispers, "We endured, and so can you. We carried light in fragile hands, and you can too." And perhaps that is the greatest medieval lesson. That beauty, knowledge, joy, and love do not wait for perfect times. They bloom even in hardship. They survive even in darkness. They endure because humanity endures.